It says we're live now.
Well, let's go.
Let's see. See if anyone can. Here, I keep reloading the page. There we are. Okay, we are live. We've got at least one person off to mute my phone. I'll try to keep my phone up so that I can see comments and so forth. But cool. Well, let's get into it. Ryan, thanks
Good.
so much for joining me to discuss Christianity and politics. Um, before we get into this a little bit, I mean, you and I have known each other now for a little while. So anyone tuning in hoping for some kind of internet blood sports might be a little bit disappointed, but that's okay. That's deserved disappointment. But for anyone who doesn't know you, and this would be a rarity on my channel because I think you're far bigger on Instagram than I am. Can you give us a little bit of basic biographical background about yourself? You've been in business and you've obviously got a tremendous library, but you're also a family man. You post all kinds of stuff about family, fatherhood, and are behind the scenes quite a bit of a business mentor of sorts to a variety
Yeah.
of people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's well, first of all, I guess I was, you know, biographical stuff about me. I mean, I was a college baseball player, and baseball consent. So a lot of my anecdotes or metaphors, are baseball related because that's how I learned a lot of stuff that I talk about. And then, yeah, I got into business and I kind of semi-retired when I was 32. Um, Started my Instagram page about 3 years ago. Um, Accidentally started writing a lot about relationships. That was never really my intention. And then, yeah, I mean, you covered a little bit of it. Um,
Well,
you know,
my,
this,
my view of your presence online is that you seem to you seem to interact with a tremendous volume of people. You see
yes,
a lot of people. And by nature of your posts, you have a unique perspective on what resonates with people at a kind of cultural and perhaps to some degree by extension kind of a political level.
sure.
So you've got your, at least in a certain part of Instagram, I mean, we're all compartmentalized to some degree, but you've got
Yeah,
your finger on the pulse of a certain part of the population, maybe better than most. And so,
yeah, for sure.
um,
Well, that and my business background. I mean, I was thinking about it at one point. You know, Women will often comment and say, "I don't know what I'm talking about because I'm not when I write about women because I'm not a woman." And it's like, well, who knows women better, you and the five women that you know well enough to like really know them,
mm-hmm,
or me who through. I mean, I've been talking to. So for me, when I started off in business, I was in sales selling like cell phones when the iPhone first came out.
mm-hmm,
And I was the number one sales rep in the country nationwide, and what was interesting about that job is it was like a cross section of people of America. It wasn't like it was just serving the poor or just serving the rich. There's certain high end restaurants that, you're going to see a higher end clientele. Then there's other industries that support, people that aren't well off.
right,
And so for me, I did that job for 7 or 8 years, and I was seeing probably 70 people a day. So if you do the math, I worked there for however long. I did all the math, and I've had like 40,000 conversations with men and women over the course of
mm-hmm,
since I was 22. I'm 41 now, so for 19 years. Um, and between all the conversations I've had in business and then all the interactions I've had on Instagram, I don't feel like I mean, compared to the average social media consumer, whoever's listening to this,
mm-hmm.
I have a very broad scope of interaction with men and women of all ages, and now because of Instagram, all over the world. I've had business meetings in Manhattan. I've had business meetings in Vegas. I mean, I've traveled, California. I've never been overseas. I haven't been overseas yet. That's really about it. And so, yeah, I think that helped a lot when I started on my Instagram page, because I do have a strange insight into, and that part of it is my experience, but part of it is just the way I view the world. Um, I do have a strange insight into human behavior, and I understand why people do what they do, not on a superficial level, but I really try to get to underneath everybody I'm interacting with. And to be good at sales, you have to understand who you're talking to,
Right.
and you have to frame it in a way that's appealing for them to take the action that you want them to take.
Well, that's a pretty impressive background, and maybe places you in an interesting psychological place, because where this conversation about Christianity and politics maybe comes down to, or starts at, we'll say, where it starts is what's the effect of Christianity on people? Now, anyone who's got some theological training should be doing the Leonardo DiCaprio up. Yeah, that's a loaded question. That's a bad question. Why are you focusing on the effect? Surely Christianity begins with, is it or is it not true? And that should be where I think this conversation wraps around to at some point. But many people, I feel like, have become interested in Christianity for political reasons,
Yes.
as seeing Christianity as some kind of
It's
tool
like
or
cultural
aid,
pushback at
right, to
this
accomplish
point.
some cultural or perhaps even political goal. And so there is a question here, and it might be an empirical question, as to what are the effects, if there are any, of Christianity on people's actual lives, on their relationships with addiction, for example, their work, their sense of satisfaction, and can that be distinguished from religiosity in a more general view? Because there will,
Oh,
of course,
yeah,
be Muslims who jump in and say, "Hey, there's a great track record of relationship between people becoming Islamic and beating addiction or having better relationships or whatever as well."
sure.
So, with this tremendous scope of your background, have you seen any kind of linear or general correlation between people becoming Christian and different life outcomes?
Um, I don't know. I don't know if it would be something that's measurable or empirical. Um, there are definitely effects. Like both of my sons, over the last few years have just come to me on their own. We don't attend a church anywhere. We do church at home.
Oh,
Both of my boys came to me in the last couple of years and decided to become Christians, um, and their behavior just changed overnight.
hmm.
Um, their self control changed overnight. Um, just their demeanor. I mean, we can have these conversations logically and rationally and empirically, but when it comes to anything spiritual, part of the reason we have debates about this stuff is because there is nothing empirical to land on. That this is definitely true and everything else is false. It's open to interpretation, personal experience. But for me, I don't know how you would measure it. I just know I've seen the before and after my whole life. So I grew up in church. My parents met at church. I played baby Jesus in the Christmas play when I was 3 years old. I went to a Christian school. Like, I live in the American South. I mean, like, I mean, I know nothing but that cultural, that culture, but that culture is very different than the heart change that happens when you have an a personal experience with Christ, and that's why, it, for the people that are trying to understand it, or is it, or, I think you raised the point, is it or is it not true? I have no doubts that it's true based on what I've experienced, but you would have to have your own experience for you to believe it. Mine won't translate over to you. You have to have, like a meeting like Paul did on the road to Damascus,
Right.
that completely changes you. And most people aren't becoming Christian because of that. That's why you don't see a change. You don't see a behavior change. You don't see anything because their heart didn't change. The Bible says, when you actually really, really become a Christian, I replaced your heart of stone with a heart of flesh. And up until then, and then there's other things, you remove the scales from your eyes. Like, I've been around the Bible my whole life. I didn't actually become a Christian until the end of 2020. Um, I lived it growing up, but but like there was so much hypocrisy in like my school and the church, and it was religiosity that I had no time for. Like, I still say fuck because I've never read anywhere in the Bible that it has anything to do with what we're like. I'm a grown ass man. I'm not going to call somebody a butthole. Like,
Yeah.
oh, you dumb butt.
We don't
Like,
need to be childish. Yeah. Yeah. We don't
exactly, and
need
that's what
a
so many
divine
people.
commandment for that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, um, one
Yeah,
of
it's
the other.
very, very unchristian to call people names like "you brood of vipers" or things like that. Very, very, very
Oh, I mean,
mean.
Jesus. People remember the brood of vipers, but they, depending on the translation you read, he said, "You're hypocrites. You're whitewashed houses that look good on the outside. You're whitewashed houses full of dead men's bones."
Yeah,
Verbatim, what he said. And it's
I
like, you're pretty on the outside, you're ugly on the inside.
that's a very nice
And
translation. Yeah.
yeah, and
Um.
so I've been around both. I've been around people who just on the surface said they were Christian, and you don't see a change. That's why so many people don't think it's real.
Mhm.
If you've been around people like who I was before and who I am now, you would say, okay, something has to explain that change. And if it's not anything measurable, then it has to be something else. Sherlock Holmes said, once every possibility has been exhausted, then whatever you're left with has to be the truth.
Mhm.
And that's
Right.
really the only way you can prove Christianity is just, I can prove it to myself, you know.
So, I was planning on holding off on this and then jumping into the truth of Christianity maybe towards the end after talking about the
We can.
but
It's
but
probably better
but
that we stick to
but
your
I think
plan.
you're well no I think I think it's fine to follow a more organic direction here, and I think most of our audience is perceptive enough to maybe understand that, you know, if Christianity is true, then the cultural effects don't matter, right? And if it's not true, well then it's not desirable, even on its own terms, right?
Yeah.
So like even if it had positive effects, it would be against its own nature. There'd be something, and we can maybe get into that later. But maybe we should talk about the truth. Mr. O3OG is anticipating where I was going to go. I was just about to bring this up. He says, Mr. O3OG, he's a Marine acquaintance, says psychedelics do that. NDE do that too, though, and that's exactly what I was going to bring up. There's an experience of profundity that people can have, that convinces them absolutely that what they experienced is profound and true and significant and overpowering. And it's not just psychedelics, although that's a very nice and easy example to point out. There are these experiences that people have in other religions too. I brought up Islam before. There are many people who have these kind of almost road to Damascus type experiences where, there was one, I was shown this by a Muslim student back when I was in college, a white Englishman who was contemplating becoming Muslim. and he was reading through the Quran, and he was said a kind of quiet prayer to himself. Said, "Allah, give me a sign if you're real." And he turns the page, and the first verse is, "Oh, disciple, why do you ask for a sign?" And it seemed like it was speaking directly to him. And
Sure. Yeah.
and to him, that coincidence felt like absolute confirmation. And this can actually go further. In my book, Holy Nihilism, I talk a little bit about my own experience when I was a believer. And I had moments where I was absolutely convinced that I heard the voice of God. I came later to realize that it was actually an internal voice in my own head that I had been primed by my congregation, by my youth group, to interpret as the voice of God. And so
Mm.
I would be telling myself to do things and imagining that I was being told this by God. And then certain somewhat amusing contradictions broke that illusion for me. But that's often how our perception works and how our memory works. It's often reconstructive. And so things that can feel profound, like absolute proof of something supernatural, are often questionable. Or at the very least, we have cases of these kinds of experiences that seem to demonstrate the divine that are mutually exclusive. And this is even true. This is even a known thing within church doctrine. If you listen to like a Catholic priest talk about demons, for example,
Hmm.
and hearing voices, they will tell people to be extremely careful, trusting their own inner
Judgment.
thoughts.
Yeah.
I remember hearing one story on the radio, because I used to listen to Christian radio a lot. I still do occasionally, actually, because it's interesting, more interesting than music sometimes. But this couple, their son had died. He was like 14. And they were just heartbroken. But a year passed, and they discovered they could were almost able to communicate with their son. Like they were able to say things to him, and he would respond to them in dreams. And they're like, "This is amazing. It's like we can speak with him again. It's not like having him here, but it's something." And they brought this to their priest, and he said, "That is not your son. Do not listen to that voice. That is extremely dangerous." And they said
Hmm.
that's maybe demonic. Now, I don't know if it's demonic or not, but the voice of God or the presence of God can also be a little bit like that. It can be very difficult to delineate our own mental projections, or just our own mental filling in the blanks. That is the process of our own perception in our day-to-day lives from demonstrable proof of the divine, subjective proof of the kind you described.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very, very broad scope as far as, um, my response to, other religions and other uh, spiritual experiences. And like, that's why I've never tried psychedelics, because I do think that it opens your mind up to demons. I think it's hard. Part of the reason we have such difficulty discussing this is because there's nothing concrete. I mean, like, for me, I that your story is very similar to a lot of people's stories. It sounds a lot like mine before I had my experience with God. But like, I didn't want it to be true. I didn't want God to be real, because then I knew that I owed him something, and he would be in control of my life. Um,
That's
and
very
so, like, when I
funny
when I
because
had my experience with God, like, my kids were too young for my to be able to just leave them like we have for this illness that I've had for the past 8, 9 months. Um, my parents, I had to call my parents and say, "I need you to take me to the hospital and have them knock me out. I'm having panic attacks." because I heard the voice of God, and like it wasn't just one coincidence. It was like 40 in a row that like I did not want to be a Christian. The last thing in the world I wanted was to be a Christian. But after a certain point of so many things happening, it's you can't deny it anymore. And a lot of people have tried to run away from Christianity. And certain people, you know, I it's not popular um, in the circles that I've ever come across. Um, but when I read the Bible, it says very clearly that God chooses who He wants
Right.
over and over and over again. He just chooses. And nowadays, people are like, "Oh, God does not like this." Like, look at the Old Testament. He chose David randomly. Everybody in the Bible He chose.
Yeah. There is a potential distinction here between who salvation is open for versus who God might choose for a particular purpose.
Yeah.
Just
And I mean overall,
mhm.
not just to play a
Oh
particular
yeah,
purpose. I think
I think
I
Calvinism is a respectable position
yeah,
theologically.
yeah. Theologically, you can't deny just verbatim what it says about how certain people have been set apart.
It
You know,
it is funny to hear that because my experience was the exact opposite. When I was a junior in high school, when I was a freshman sophomore, I was very very intense, um, in my belief. Like I was really into
yeah.
being
It
Christian.
sounds like
And then it was my junior year of high school. I remember it very vividly. It was October. I finally came to realize that I no longer believed. And there was a period where I was tremendously angry. Not at God, not at Christianity. I was angry at my community for the casualness of their dalliance into this belief that if it were true would require all consuming attention and devotion. And they're
that's what
so
happened to me.
half-hearted about it. And
Yeah,
so I was mad at them, but even in that, I wished it was true. And I think even in high school, I recognized like, okay, these people, if it is true, these people clearly don't represent the true
yeah.
nature
And
of
that's
faith.
the tricky part.
But I very much wanted it to be true. And then after that, like several months of like seething, like I cannot believe I like was in for this. I became a kind of reluctant atheist. I was like, well, like I wish I could believe. I'm happy these people seem to be enjoying it or whatever. I can't bring myself. And it wasn't until like college that I like really discovered the new atheists and became a bit of a a bit of a nuisance. Um, and then I came around again via Joseph Campbell to try Christianity round two. It was actually during that phase that I got married and also wrote In Defense of Hatred as a, I won't say a believing Christian, but as a practicing Christian, with the idea that maybe if I practice it and make a habit out of it, belief will follow the action. And
Mm.
the opposite happened. The more I dwelt in it, the more I practiced it, the more I thought about it. I'm like the 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 mental tricks, it seemed to me, that brought people into belief became clear. Like I began to
Yeah.
see the sort of
No,
psychological mechanisms by
I went through the
which.
same thing before. Like I said, I mean, I went to a Christian school, and so I wanted it to be true too. I was, and then, my wife was a Christian, having kids, even, I don't know, like I, something that I never questioned for myself. Once I had older kids, I started questioning, like I don't believe this, but should I teach my kids this so that they might be able to believe, and you see that a lot geographically, you see that a lot with where I live, I mean, almost everybody I know goes to church. You know, like when I say I don't go to church, there's you know, but I think that's gaining in popularity now. I think what you're seeing now more and more culturally is home churches getting away from the hypocrisy and the legalism of the American church. I think you're going to see a lot of people that are believing, practicing Christians that don't attend a church anywhere.
That's very interesting to me because, like, on the one hand,
That's the future.
I get it from a very practical cultural position, but isn't it in the scripture that you're supposed to um, pray together, and that Jesus is present whenever the believers come together in His name? I know that doesn't have to be in an institutional building per se,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
when you have an institution that has been built up in devotion to that, it
Well,
feels like
you have to go back to when. Well, I won't frame it as a question. I'll just say Christianity, like I'm describing, is the Christianity that conquered the Roman Empire. They didn't have a Bible. There was no legalism. There was no physical location. All they had were Paul's letters.
when you say conquered, what do you mean?
Well, you know what I mean. Infiltrated and subverted the Roman Empire. It spread across the known world essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity spread throughout the entire Roman Empire when
Right.
it functioned like I'm describing, where people would just get together and read the Bible together. There's no biblical mandate that you have, like, if you it's in First or Second Timothy, the requirements for being a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say anything about theology in there or going to
Right.
get a theology degree. It just says your wife and your kids have to respect you. You can't be a drunkard. You have to be respected in your community. You have to enjoy having people over at your home. Like Paul clearly lays out the definition of you have to do to be a pastor. And he doesn't say anything about going to college for it.
Right.
And so,
I would agree with that as
and
as
there are just as many. I mean, why do we follow that one? You know, you got to meet with other believers, but we ignore 200 other. You know, it's the same way. Like
what
you got to go to church. You can't cuss. You can't drink. You can't watch porn.
well, I think
Other, the legalism
the
part.
the
Like
argument for going to church, I think, would be the spirit of humility telling you that you don't already know everything there is to know about Christianity. In the same way that
that's not why people aren't going to church. They're people are stopping going to a physical church because of the hypocrisy, because they don't like the people,
okay.
and because the preaching is watered down bullshit.
So would you say that the people in church are worse than people outside of church, or are roughly equivalent?
It just depends on how you're measuring them. They're much better people as people in terms of outcomes than somebody who's not a Christian. They're going to show, like when I posted pictures when I had my illness, like my house was packed full of strangers that came over to pray for me. Like nobody donates more to charity in America, but everybody talks down on the church. Like nobody donates more to charity than the American church.
Mm-hmm. Now it sort of presumes a Christian value that donating to charity is a good thing, is a
Yes.
beneficial thing. There is we were sort of, before we were recording, we were talking a little about other characters in the sort of political social sphere. One in particular, named Costin Alamariu, um, who would take a Nietzschean thing. Is like, is it really good to siphon money downward in that way? Thomas Sowell has made arguments of a more economic nature that maybe supporting giving money to charities or is maybe not always beneficial.
Well, giving it to the church is different. I don't mean giving. I don't mean giving money to charities. I mean who brings all the food to the food drives? Who brings all? When I was a kid, we had the angel tree, where it would be for like we had the angel tree at the mall at
Mm.
Christmas time, and it was for kids who were in like foster care or whatever, and we would always grab an angel and we would buy whatever the kid wanted, and we turned it in, and that was like that was a toy drive that the church ran,
Mm-hmm.
you
So,
know.
so
So there are measurable things like generosity, like charity, and all those things that I think the people that attend church are well intentioned. I just can't stand to be around them because it's almost like what you were saying before we went live about how you can tell the difference between people who have suffered and people who haven't.
mm,
Like most of the church is filled with people that grew up in church and nothing bad's ever happened to them, and they're just wide-eyed and innocent. And I can't be around like grown-ass men who are so naive, like that they can't even carry on a sentence, and they're grown-ass men saying words like dumb butt. Or that's just silliness. It's like, no, that's called bullshit. Just say the word. It's just a word,
yeah.
you know. The people who are practicing Christians are measurably better people than the people I'm around that aren't Christian. There's a level of behavior that they'll never succumb to.
Okay, so it's not that they are better like we were talking about quantification and the challenge there before, but they have some kind of firmer floor that they won't stoop below. You're saying,
Yeah,
as a general rule. Okay.
yeah.
Whereas friends who are maybe otherwise good people but who aren't Christian will
Oh, my
maybe
my.
risk compromising
I
in
have a
order.
guy that works for me that he's one of the best people he's probably the best person I've ever met. And he's not a Christian. I mean, Christianity doesn't make you a good person. It just
Mhm.
provides a loose set of, like, you as a pagan can still trust that a practicing Christian isn't going to will never do certain things.
Well, we might be running into a category problem here because non-Christian is actually not a category, and this is a point that Curtis Yarvin brought up in his book, but you don't need to read Curtis Yarvin to understand the point. If like people subscribe to all kinds of myths, right, and they derive their sense of what is good, what is beautiful, what is worth aspiring towards from these inspirational myths. And if I say, well, I subscribe to the Homeric myths, and so I have these ideals, but this other person over here does not subscribe to that, so they'll fall for anything. Completely neglects that maybe they're a Christian, which is a completely different myth set, and that is
Yeah,
its
that's
own
interesting.
constraining system. So to say people who are not Christian will drop below, well, like a lot depends upon the myths that they hold to, right?
Yeah,
So
I guess now that I hear now that I hear you say that, if I rephrased it, it would just be, what you're going to get with a Christian. You know what their worldviews are. No, you know what their worldview is. You know what they consider to be good. You know what they consider to be harmful. Whereas in your case, I don't know. I think even people that aren't Christian know a few things about what to expect from a Christian. And so,
mm,
like, if you say you're a Christian, you say a cuss word, then people that aren't Christians are like, "But I thought you were a Christian. Christians didn't cuss." Like, our boundary rules.
yeah,
Whereas with yours, it's not. Um, I can't. It's not easy for me to like project or anticipate
sure.
what you will do or not do
It's
if I
it's
don't if I don't if I'm not as familiar with your myths.
it's slightly off topic, but it's a fun tangent. So, my quick and dirty introduction to the Homeric spiritual mythos and ethos is that the Iliad is actually the foundation for Christian spirituality. everything you need to know spiritually about the Iliad is actually in the New Testament. The New Testament is a completion and a expansion upon the notions of heroism you find in the Iliad.
Mm.
The asterisk there is that, from my view, the New Testament takes them too far. It takes heroism beyond what is actually accurate in the world and beyond what's actually desirable. In the Iliad, the hero is someone who is admirable, who is culture creating, maybe even almost world creating in a way, but we don't envy them, and you don't aspire to be them. And there's maybe something better to be than a hero. And we see that character in the ideal of the man that we find in Odysseus, who's not evil, but he's not morally good either. He has his own kind of loyalty to family and country, and he's very competent. But he's not aspiring to be a hero. He's not trying to die so that he might live in eternal glory like Achilles, or like Socrates, or Jesus.
Yeah.
And so, but there's still a degree of respect for the hero and gratitude, but without elevating. We don't think of the hero as a god, maybe a son of one of the gods, and the parallels are quite extraordinary. Actually, there's a wonderful book by Greg Nage that without ever mentioning the Bible brings up so many New Testament themes, like the importance of the tomb, the suffering, the vicarious suffering specifically. Achilles actually means the suffering of the people. That's what the name is, and that's what Jesus does, right? So there's a lot of Hellenic rather than Semitic themes in the New Testament. So
It's interesting.
there's a lot of crossover, and you have this beautiful Greek warrior statue behind you. The first of the 9 worthies that set the standards for what it meant to be a Christian knight was not a Christian. It was a pagan from the Iliad, and that was Hector. So Hector sets the standard for the Christian knight. He wasn't the only one, of course. There were 2 other pagans, and then 3 Jews, and then finally 3 Christians that formed the 9 worthies that were the models. But Hector was the first. And so,
How so?
well, he was
Like, what did they do? They just took a vow.
The knights.
Yeah.
Well, they look up to these 9 model warriors in the same way that Catholics look up to the saints as ideals.
Makes sense.
They're canonized warriors, so to speak. So, to me, the Christian world is a close cousin. We're like, we have our disagreements, but at the end of the day, we're in the same family. And the only difference is, like, where's the line of like God and man, and this concept of sin and original sin is, of course, very different in the pagan world. And the pagan world acknowledges suffering. It's all about suffering. The Iliad, not just the Iliad, but the Odyssey too. But it doesn't look at man as a fallen being that is inherently in need of salvation. It doesn't look upon the world in this as a fallen or corrupted place. It says there are certainly challenges, there are certainly problems, but it's also always changing, and there's new things coming up. And there's this beautiful line at the beginning of the Odyssey where Zeus says, how shameless these mortals are for always blaming us gods when they themselves compound their sufferings beyond its proper share. It's like we do things, and this would be a Pelagian heresy, I guess. We could also just not do things that harm ourselves, or just accept that and bear the responsibility, and not put that responsibility for our outcomes on a vicarious savior. But beyond these theological distinctions, which, as we were talking about before, do have implications on our culture. They affect what kinds of people we become. And a great problem in the pagan world is that so many people become pagan out of spiteful, I'm going to do the opposite of thing A, and B happens to be an opposite, so I'm going to become a Nordic black metal Satanist pagan. And it's like that's not really
It
like
doesn't
what
take
that
any,
is. And
it
what's
doesn't take any like intellectual vigor
no, and it's funny.
to just do the opposite of something.
Yeah, what's really funny is you can actually see. My friend Jack and I have joked about this now. Satanist Christians, and when we say
What's
Satanist, we mean having the spirit of opposition and accusation, and they tend to become Orthodox Christians or Catholics. They tend
mm,
to take on a lot of black and white iconography, especially with skulls. They tend to be young guys who've been Orthodox or Catholic for less than a year, and they are nominally Christian, but they are Satanist in spirit. They're not becoming Christian because they love God. They're becoming Christian because they hate liberal democracy, basically. You know the type, I'm sure.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Um, but anyways, a sort of a tangent about about where my sort of Homeric mythic frame is. But my contention is that, and I kind of got into it actually with one of my favorite living writers last week, named Matthew Crawford, who's been moving into Christianity, and he's in this trend of people who are trying to kind of use Christianity for certain social or cultural ends.
Hmm.
And as you and I were talking about before, it kind of doesn't work that way, which is not to say that there aren't effects, but there are also effects to other paths. Um, and I think that some of Friedrich Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity, of this sort of enervation of the positive and the healthy um, side of life, is a real cost.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, everything has a cost. You know, it's definitely that's one of the reasons that I struggled to be a Christian, you know, is because I wanted to enjoy the life that I have here and not be so focused on the afterlife. You know, it makes it hard. And I went through a similar phase, you know, after, like you talked about, if it is true and you really, and your heart really is changed, it's an all-consuming change.
Right. And
And
the
that's why I had the reaction that I did, and I had to have my parents take me to the hospital and just have me knocked out, you know, because if it's true, there's a lot of expectations that come along with it, and people don't seem to think that there's any um, cost that they should have to pay to become a Christian when Jesus paid the ultimate price. The ultimate price.
right. So it seems like we're maybe in agreement that the people who seek to who believe that Christianity will lead to certain better outcomes culturally or politically are on the wrong footing, or at the very least have their heart in the wrong place, and that it
I
may or
mean,
may not.
everything. You're talking about power, man. People are always going to use whatever tool they can to gain power. Like Donald Trump's not a Christian,
No, he's not.
you
No,
know.
he's very not a Christian.
I mean, so of course, I mean, there's no way to argue. I mean, anybody that tries to argue with that is just foolish. But
Right.
that
Was
doesn't,
Joe Biden a Catholic?
yeah, exactly. But that doesn't have any bearing on any. I mean, dude, I mean, if we made a religion out of like not wearing yoga pants, which at this
Right.
point you could, because where I live in the South, everybody's a Christian. It's just what kind, you know.
Right.
And so you got Pentecostal, and you got people that you can always tell because like on my son's basketball team, he plays homeschool basketball, and obviously a lot of his peers are Christian, and Like the boys have to wear sweatpants to play basketball games because they're not allowed to show their legs. The women have to wear dresses. They can't wear pants at all. They can't wear makeup. They can't color their hair. Um, and that's called Pentecostal. There's a whole denomination for that. Like I've joked with my wife now, like we could do that now about yoga pants because guys like Will Spencer get on Instagram and make a huge deal about what women wear at the gym, and it's just
Yeah.
like,
Will Spencer doesn't know what he's talking
well, I'm just
about.
in general,
Yeah.
you can't negate the effects of Christianity or the benefits to society that Christianity would have,
Well, it's
just
just
because people happen to be using it to gain power. I mean, people will use anything to gain power.
sure. Oh, for sure. So it's maybe not it's maybe not quantifiable, yet at the same time we could have faith if we were believers that the effects would
Well,
likely be positive.
yeah,
But
exactly.
people who begin with with particular earthly goals, like I want to reduce immigration, or I
Yeah.
want to reduce single motherhood, or I want to like my earthly goal is X, and Christianity will help me accomplish that. One, it may or may not do that. And two, if your goal is to advance Christianity, the success of advancing Christianity will cause people to lose interest in your goal, regardless of whether it accomplishes that goal or not. That's no longer an issue. This is actually Augustine's City of God, the opening part, the actual book City of God talks about a lot of things. But it began as a polemic against the pagans who were saying that the conversion to Christianity caused the sack of Rome in, was it 299 or whenever it was.
Yeah.
And his answer was, well, no, Christianity didn't cause it. It didn't really stop it, but your pagan beliefs wouldn't have helped you either. But look at us Christians, how unbothered we are by the sacking of the city.
Hmm.
We can experience the loss of the city with a degree of aloof indifference. And it was actually that aloof indifference that partially inspired me to write Holy Nihilism. Um, it,
I
at the
can see that.
time that the Cathedral of Notre Dame got burned down,
Yeah.
not completely, of course, but fairly seriously damaged, and it looks like arson. They can claim all they want that it was a renovation accident. I think they're still trying to claim that, but there were like not just hundreds of but thousands of confirmed church arsons in France and other parts of Europe like that year. The odds that it was just a renovation accident are very, very slim.
Yeah.
And many
Well, that's an example right there. Christians would never do that.
well, but here's the thing. I asked around like people like, oh, what did you think of that, the freaking burning down the cathedral, because many people, and not just Christians, are very attached to that. And what I found just anecdotally in my friend group was that the people who are either not Christian or nominally Christian, I'll say like the Tucker Carlsons, I can't speak to Tucker Carlson's heart, but he seems like a culturally Christian person, were very outraged, were very upset by it. They're like they like wanted that was a cue to like cut off immigration in Europe. It's like
Yeah.
this has to stop. The most sincere believing Christians I knew, who I mentioned this to, were like, "Oh yeah, that's really sad." Anyways, what's for lunch?
Yeah.
Completely unfazed by it. And I think there's a certain kind of person who sees a kind of stoic, aspirational. There's something admirable in that, in being completely unfazed by the destruction of one of the greatest architectural achievements in Europe.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think that's admirable, personally. I don't think that kind of indifference or aloofness is a good thing. And people will
Mhm.
point back to, well, like, look at the Crusades, and they'll point back to all these cases in Christian history of
No, but
people
don't get me started. The
who
Crusades,
were
the whole
Christians.
world would be Muslim right now if it wasn't for the
Oh,
Crusades.
oh, oh! I endorse and support the Crusades. The
Yeah.
question of whether or not certain instances of Christian care for the world were truly Christian
Oh,
is a
yeah.
separate question from whether or not it was good. Because again,
Yeah, they're
we're talking about
very. I mean, here's the
good
thing. I
by
mean,
earthly. What's our standard for good? Is it, are we judging the heart, or are we judging the earthly outcome? This is
that's
why
why
I
you
think
have to. That's
focusing
why
on
you
the
have to
earthly outcome.
separate. That's why you have to separate the two. Like fundamentally, most everything I've said about Christianity has been personal. When I step outside of personal, fundamentally, Christianity isn't something that we're supposed to be looking at worldly outcomes. We're supposed to have that,
Right.
what you're talking about, where we're unfazed because and I struggle with it for the same reasons that you just are more, I don't know, extreme, and like I see the same problems. You just went to the extreme of saying I am a pagan, whereas I don't.
I'm following the advice of Bishop Robert Barron, who's an instructor and a theologian in his own right. Robert Sokolowski told the seminary class, said, if you ever find that you can no longer be a Catholic anymore, you should become a pagan, which is a very shocking thing to tell a class of seminary students. Um, it doesn't mean become a freaking New Age Wiccan, or it doesn't mean like that kind of thing. It means, you know, I think what he means is a religious and proper respect for the greater forces in nature. Because paganism is a natural religion as opposed to a supernatural religion. And pagan is
Mm,
actually a broad category for a lot of different religions. Like, you know, the various branches of Hinduism are not the same thing as like Buddhist, Shinto, or Native American
sure.
animism, and so on and
Yes.
so forth. But it describes this class of natural religions, of respecting the force and venerating the natural forces of the world, with due respect and graciousness, and I would say gratitude, and respecting the wisdom that we can learn from the great works of the past. And I put Homer at the very top of that list, because
You
it
should.
seems to be the best
Yeah.
to me. And there's, like, when I say I believe the New Testament is, I don't want to say derivative of, but inspired by the Iliad. That's a meant as a compliment. I think
Yeah.
Christianity gets
I agree.
a
I
lot of
understand what you mean.
things right, but again, maybe a little bit too far in some ways. Maybe not if Christianity is true, right? Um,
Yeah.
I hold that Christianity is not true, and I make the somewhat bold claim in Holy Nihilism that we can actually know it's not true, and we can know that Christianity is not true based upon the kinds of arguments that people have used to arrive at the idea of a singular God since before Christianity it was even on the table. Um, we can find these arguments in the works of people like Plato and Aristotle. We can find it even before that, if you go back. But it always comes down to, there's a long kind of complicated version of it that I wrote down, but the simple form is God is, advanced as an idea of the perfect or the ultimate. And that's actually a confusion of categories, and it's a confusion of language that we group many different distinct kinds of things together into a single category that we experience similarly, called perfection or ultimate or beauty. And we personify or reify that concept as a singular entity. But these kinds of ontological categories of experience don't exist in the actual world. Perfection is not a thing. beauty even is not an actual thing in the world. It's a category, linguistic category of experience that we give to many different kinds of things. So if we were to say, this God is beauty, we can accept that as at a mythopoetic level and say, okay, I can kind of work with this anthropomorphization. But as soon as that deity also claims for itself the name of truth, we have a contradiction that's a little bit too brazen, I think, to just accept as poetry. And that's what we see in Christianity, where Jesus says, God is logos, not just logos, but aletheia, truth itself. Everybody who believes in truth believes in me. To which Pontius Pilate replies, and what is truth?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tricky question. What is truth actually? Is it just what is? Are we taking a correspondence notion of truth, or do we have a tricky coherence notion of truth, like some of Plato's characters, or like Immanuel Kant, or like Jay Dyer, right, with his and Andrew Wilson with their tag arguments, which are all built on this coherence model of truth where everything has to neatly fit together, but it's all built on this very rickety subjective foundation of language and our categorical combinations of unlike things together. And God, the very idea of God, again, going back to Plato and before Christianity, always comes down to this kind of categorical conflation, which we prime ourselves to believe in by language, and then after we prime it, we see evidence for it in the world.
Yeah.
So by the nature of God, by the ontology of God, we can know he does not exist, is my argument.
Man, like I said, I spent a lot of hours in church, and I don't know how to respond to that. I think, in general, I think we're just off by degrees at this point, because a lot of that is why I have such a hard time with the idea of going to a church, is because, for instance, I had a local group that I was running for about a year of local men. There's about 12 of us, and one night before the meeting started, I was talking about reading, and I hear this from almost every man that I talk to around where I am geographically, and they said, "Man, I just can't remember what I read when I read it. Like I don't have any reading comprehension. I hadn't read a book since high school, and then they go, except for the Bible, of course." And so they can read and understand the Bible and memorize it, but they can't read anything else. And those types of men, I just have so much lack of respect for. I can't be around them. I'm just like, you're getting on my nerves. Like, you just being here is getting on my nerves because you're so goofy. You're such a goofball. To a degree, it takes a little bit of that to hold with any religion, because you're thinking so deeply about it. I can, I don't know that I've ever thought that deeply about anything, but the arguments and stuff that you're making, I don't have like a rebuttal any more than I would say. I don't know that I would believe in anything. I don't know that anything could pass the scrutiny.
Well, then let's bring it back to
If I looked at it in that level of detail, I don't know that there's much that's provable other than math.
well
Math is provable, but everything else is very subjective.
It's very funny you bring up math. Math was the object of some serious deconstruction in one of my essays I wrote for the Jack's Order Fire anthology last year. So much of math is actually employed by the transcendental arguers as evidence for God, and William Lane Craig does this. Turns out math is actually just language, devoid of semantic content. It's a pure grammar, and it's subject to many of the foibles of all of the foibles of language that language itself is. It just creates the illusion that we are discovering relationships rather than creating them, because of the separation between the mathematical content and the world it's describing. We've moved the contents into the domain of X and Y, and so it looks like it's always true and eternally true. And in reality, that is also self-delusion, which does not mean that math isn't tremendously useful. It is. It's just to say that you can't make grand proclamations about the nature of the universe based upon math in the way that some people like to think. There was a funny meme going around about all the people saying, "Oh, beauty is objective. Look at the golden ratio, whatever," and they put the nautilus shell, and then someone else will superimpose the nautilus shell over like a morbidly obese bear, or like a fat plumber on a ladder with his like ass hanging out. It's like it fits it perfectly. It's like, this is objective beauty. doesn't quite work that way. The important point here, as far as religion is concerned, is that not all religions are alike, and this is why like Zen Buddhism and many strains of Hinduism is almost more of a category of religions than it is a single religion. But many religions don't require belief exactly in the way that the Christian one does.
Just practice.
It's not about truth. And the way I had the tremendous pleasure of being able to interview Greg Nosh, actually, who's one of my favorite, I might have mentioned him before, classists, and he described the ancient Greek hero myths and hero cults not as stories to believe in, but as stories to live by, which is different. And the best introduction, I actually have an essay about this coming out later this year. The best introduction to that is Santa Claus. Santa is a hero cult. Christmas is a Santa hero cult. It's not just a Santa hero cult. There's obviously Jesus in there. There's some older Yule stuff that doesn't involve Santa in there too. It's a few different things, but the Santa part is a hero myth. It's a hero cult specifically that we participate in. And most of us participants don't believe in him literally in that way. We don't believe in him. We live out the myth. We reenact it as a story worth participating in. And that's what most religions, perhaps at least many of them, have looked like throughout history. And that is just as legitimate a mode of participation as opposed to belief. That's just as legitimate of a foundation for religiosity and spiritual identity, especially if you believe that we are what we repeatedly do as belief. And it's a very different mindset, and it sort of the juxtaposition maybe reveals how deeply and how long we've been swimming in tacitly Christian waters most of our cultural lives. But it's might be an interesting thing for people to explore. And again, like there would be nothing necessarily wrong with looking at Jesus as a hero cult figure and saying, well, I don't know about the historicity of it. I'm like, the Shroud of Turin is interesting. I have my doubts, but I'm open to it. But like, I'm gonna follow this because I think it's a beautiful story. That would be legitimate were it not for the insistence upon truth, right? For Paul saying, if he didn't come back from the grave, then all of our hope and faith is in vain, right? So the truth thing is where things get dicey. And it's where we sort of shift our foundation for religiosity from participation into something like belief.
That's interesting. It's an interesting detail.
And so if your religiosity is based on this like aesthetic appreciation for like, this is a beautiful story. This is a story I'm going to participate in. This is an ideal I'm going to follow. Then the point you made about like, if you think too deeply about anything, you can destroy it. That's exactly what postmodernism was. Postmodernism was the recognition that the truth orientation is actually all destroying. Nothing survives. Nothing survives sufficiently objective analysis.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with the postmodernists was that they never escaped that framework. They never escaped the truth framework.
Mm-hmm.
They stay there as like, oh, truth destroys everything, so therefore we should destroy everything. They never made the jump of like, oh, maybe that was never like the right foundation. That's the proper move. And then you get back to, what story do I want to live in? What's the best story to be in? And that's where I think Homer really comes to the rescue. And I gotta say, Christianity's got a pretty good story. You know, it wouldn't be as big as it is if it didn't have a great story.
Yeah, exactly.
But that emphasis on truth, that emphasis on aletheia, kind of sets up the problem.
Yeah, it does.
And I think we can bring it back to the cultural and social stuff too, because if you have a singular notion of truth and good, then how could something be good for some people but not good for others? Is it truly good if it isn't good for everybody? You have,
Yeah, I think so.
in sort of Galatians 3:8, which is a horrifically abused verse, but it's still there, and just because it's abused sometimes doesn't mean there isn't a legitimate point to it. And that's the in the Spirit there is no freeman or slave, no man or woman, no Jew or Gentile, but all are one in Christ. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Horrifically abused verse, but it's still there. And what is the meaning of that exactly? And if we embody that as believers, putting on my Christian hat for a second, how does one argue against, for example, open border immigration? Don't we want to help the world, not out of a literal sense of like, there's no Americans and non-Americans, man, but in a more deeply spiritual sense of, if I'm going to be living in the Spirit, there are Americans and non-Americans, but I'm not going to concern myself with that, and I'm going to focus upon evangelizing and helping those in need. And like, there is a line from the Sermon on the Mount to sort of what we see in the early Unitarians, even at the beginning of the United States, and into the sort of progressivism that we see today. I've worked on a few churches in downtown in the city where I live, and there are, in many cases, more rainbow flags than there are crosses. Now,
Are you serious?
oh yeah, like sometimes
Well, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, churches are dying, but people are going back to home churches.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Right.
The church is always recruiting. Ever since it became the church was never intended. We were never supposed to have pastors. Bible never clearly that makes that a case for the fact that there should be special, knowledgeable people that know how to read this better than other people.
That's an interesting take. I there that makes some passages a little bit peculiar. For example, there's a verse that promises a special crown for pastors in heaven, or it doesn't call them pastors, of course, like you're saying, but it does call them like teachers, as those distinguished from other believers. But it also holds these people to a much higher standard. And so it's a dangerous thing spiritually to become a teacher, because it's much easier to
Very
misstep.
dangerous. Yeah.
So
But that's, I mean, that's why what you're talking about is why churches are dying, because there was never supposed to be a physical building. Nobody's ever supposed, it never says anywhere in the Bible that a pastor is supposed to be your profession, where you have to make sure that everybody stays happy, otherwise they stop tithing. Tithing isn't biblical. It was the taxation, it was the form of taxation that the nation of Israel had took on. Like there's nothing in like the what we think of as the church is not in the Bible. And I think Christianity would be much better off if it stopped trying to be used for that's what gets on my nerves about it, is that people try to take it and apply it to what we do down here, when in reality it's predominantly about what happens after this life. It doesn't you can't go to the Bible for everything. It does. If I want to save money on my taxes, do I read the Bible, or do I go talk to an accountant?
right.
If I want electricity, and did you learn how to be an electrician from the Bible?
Well, not the Christian Bible. We have our code book, which is a Bible of
You
sorts.
know,
But yeah,
so Christianity, the Bible, the belief system, all of it has its place in our daily lives, but it's primarily about the belief, like you said, the belief and what happens after this life, the afterlife. Jesus basically says that through every time somebody asks him, I don't care about that. I'm here to talk about eternity. I don't
right.
care that the cathedral in Notre Dame burned down. I'm here to talk about the afterlife. There'll be prettier cathedrals in heaven. Like fundamentally, that's hard for me because I want to enjoy this life, and that's
Yeah.
part of the reason why I was an atheist. But I don't think Christianity can be like the governing thing that we build our society around, because there's not enough information in the Bible
Well,
to tell us how to build our society around it. It's about how I treat you. It's about my heart. It's about an entirely different set of issues than how we govern ourselves, how we tax each other. Like the Bible doesn't give us any guidance on any of that stuff. Like, what do you do if your kid tries to commit suicide? What does the Bible tell us?
well,
Nothing.
if we're gonna bracket the Bible, let me take things one step further. Since your own spirituality, I won't say religiosity, because um, the aforementioned issues with religion, but if your spirituality is built on um, these kinds of experiences, direct experiences that are apart from what's directly in the Bible. I want to introduce a character here, and I know it's a little late in the conversation to be introducing new information, but someone who has been variously called the greatest theologian of the 20th century is a man by the name of John Hick. John
Hmm.
Hick is an English theologian who I will introduce in short form as the big guns behind the coexist bumper sticker. He is a religious pluralist and advances a theology of pluralism based upon a foundation in religious experience. He says the religious experiences we have, while sometimes contradicting each other, are nevertheless legitimate. And he uses this to form he uses basically the blind man and the elephant metaphor
Yeah.
to say we're all glimpsing parts of a single truth. And so he says he advances a notion of we'll put Christianity in scare quotes, of religious salvation, which he defines as moral transformation through revelation, but Christianity is no longer exclusive. Islam and Hinduism and all the major religions, which have a long-standing tradition attached to these powerful religious experiences, have a path to salvation, in his view. And this is a foundation for religious pluralism that has clear downstream political effects.
Yeah.
I think, which sort of speak for themselves. Now, a certain kind of right wing online Christian will point to sort of old world Christian Europe and point to the social effects as evidence of the truth of the belief behind it. Now, for me, that doesn't work because of Africa. Um, and there's a lot of historical asterisks there. It's like Ethiopia is maybe better than some of the other countries, and it's been Christian longest. But Rwanda was the most Christian country in Africa at the time of the genocide.
Mm.
Um, Christianity is practiced quite seriously in Latin America. It has been practiced very seriously in India for not just centuries, but millennia.
Yeah.
It's a very, very old church in India. And, the outcomes seem quite wildly divergent.
It's
So,
because that's because it's about the afterlife.
right.
It's not
So,
about life down here.
but when I look at John Hick's argument for pluralism, what if we begin if we're bracketing the Bible, we're saying that we can't look to the Bible for everything. We have to begin with our initial experiences. Where is John Hick wrong, or is he perhaps correct? To me, the problem with John Hick's argument is that it requires us to take the experience seriously, but at the same time to not take the content of the experience seriously.
I can't get there with the pluralism thing, and especially if we're talking about outcomes, because I mean, if you look at what happened in Afghanistan when the Taliban took back over and strict Sharia law got reinstituted back into Afghanistan. I mean, if Muslims won and actually had the power to control it, anytime Muslims have the power to control anything, they become a third world country.
Lauren says Ryan is keeping it real. She says has some comments about denominations and uh, other things. Good stuff.
Good.
Yeah, no, that this is the
I mean, look at Europe and
paradox of
America
tolerance.
compared to look at Europe and the United States, not just right this minute, but for the past 400 years.
So should we care about those outcomes?
I mean, if you have to,
You
you
have
have
to.
to care about those outcomes.
Does that mean we have to not be Christian?
'Cause- no, I mean, if we're just looking at outcomes, and this is to me, this isn't tied to like the bracketing of the Bible argument. This is just tied to Christianity for whatever reason seems to be linked with first world countries.
Like
You know,
Mexico?
well, Mexico wasn't founded by Europeans. It's
But
still the
so
natives.
talking Greece then?
I
Romania?
mean, South America was already what it was. It was the Spanish that.
What about Greece and Romania and Eastern Europe?
That's a lot of Orthodox, isn't it?
Yes, Greece is like in many
Greek
ways
Orthodox thing.
the heart of Christianity in many ways,
Yeah,
geographically speaking.
yeah. Um, I mean, now I would say Buddhism, and if I'm trying to be objective, I would say Buddhism and Christianity have built the best countries. If we're talking about culture and bracketing things and
Buddhism.
which one leads to better outcomes and all that, I mean, when you think of South America, you don't think Christian. It's just,
You
I
don't?
don't.
I think of Catholic. they're
I mean,
intensely Catholic.
it's not as prominent as Christianity in the United States.
Really? I
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Well, we'll have to check. And this might be one of those things where it's difficult to quantify, right? Maybe Brazil has a greater number of nominally religious people per capita, but maybe for them Christianity is an identity and not like a puritanical
Well, and I'm
devotion.
looking at it, like I said, over the course of the past 400 years. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
going back to the discovery of the continents.
Well, there's also a question of like what is good in life as well. Like we when we look at, first of all, how well do we know what's going on in other countries? I have a pretty good idea that North Korea is basically a concentration camp and is awful to live in because I've been told that by my government and its agents. I wonder
There's
what
a
the
lot of
North.
people that have,
Yeah.
like I personally know a family that her
it,
mom.
it, it might incidentally be true, to be clear. But also we're also to imagine like what are the North Korean teachers telling North Korean students about what it's like to be in America.
Yeah,
Um, Even if they had the correct facts, could they
but you
convey
have
the
you have
sense?
people that have lived in both places that say it's objectively better.
What do we mean objectively better?
Like their life is better, freedom, money. I mean, that could be a whole podcast in itself.
Yeah. There's a wonderful book by Sebastian Junger called Tribe. I shouldn't say wonderful because I haven't read it. But I've read passages and I've heard him talk about it, about how in the early days of America, where we had English and also Spanish and French colonists living over on the East Coast, there were exchanges at times of Amerindian warriors and women as well who came to live among the whites, and there were cases of whites who lived among the Amerindians. And if you look at the matter objectively, which is say quantitatively, you would say, well, the Westerners had it better. We had civilization, we had more money, more better guns. We had carts and all kinds of cool technology and bigger houses and so forth. And yet, what Sebastian Junger noticed was that
Oh, I
all
remember.
of the
I've read that book.
okay, like all the Amerindians said, no, I want to be back in the tribes, but many of the white people were like, I think I might prefer.
Yeah,
I might prefer to stay here.
yeah.
And
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
to Christianity's credit, there is this sense. There's this sense of rejecting like what is necessarily like better according to the world,
Then what? But I
giving
mean,
away
why
one's
is it
wealth and
that
so forth.
everybody wants to be in our countries then? Why do we have to close our borders if everything's so great?
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
Europeans have been
So,
overrun with Muslim
to be
immigrants.
clear, I, as an American, think America is best because I'm an American and I have American
Yeah.
notions of what's better. But what I don't think is happening is that people are fleeing from the much more Christian Mexico to the substantially less Christian, or at least more religiously diaspora, the United States, because we're more Christian. And I
But
don't think
it's the effects of.
and I don't think people are fleeing from the Muslim Middle East to the highly secularized Europe because it's more religious.
No, but I'm saying
But people also want to go to Europe.
When Islam comes in, it destroys everything and turns it into a third world country. Like Afghanistan in the 70s, that was the example that I was going to say earlier. I know a girl that her mom grew up in Afghanistan in like the 70s, and it was like they had movie theaters and they had nightclubs and they wore skirts and all kinds of stuff. And then
The
the Muslims
Westerners
came to.
ruined it. The Westerners made it degenerate and awful, says Will Spencer.
Well, like
Sorry.
Islam came in and took over, and now it's a third world country again.
My favorite Afghanistan story goes back to the second or third century. Apparently, back when it was called Bactria, when Alexander the Great was attempting to conquer Afghanistan, he couldn't do it militarily. It was the one place he really struggled with, and it was the geography. It was just too rugged, too difficult. So he ended up conquering it. Instead of conquering it militarily, he did it politically. He allied himself with some warlords, basically the pastoral Pashtun place back then that it is now. And he just allied his way into owning it, basically. And so he started building roads, but he realized he still had enemies there that were destroying his roads. And so he called together his tribal war chief allies. It says, hey, we're still up against guerrilla resistance. We need to put this down. People are destroying the roads. And his allies are like, oh, no, that was us. We were destroying the roads. We don't want to be connected to the outside world. We like it here alone. And the legend I heard, it was that was when Alexander the Great gave up on Bactria. That was when he gave up on Afghanistan and said, screw it. It was basically, have you ever seen the movie The World's End with Simon Pegg and Nick, what's that English comic duo who does Shaun of the Dead?
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, they have this movie called The World's End where an alien robot force tries to take over the world like the Borg for peace and prosperity and to take him to the next stage. At the end, it ends with two protagonists drunkenly yelling at this thing, "You're not going to tell us what to do," or just basically saying, "Fuck off. We're Americans. We're not Americans. We're human beings, and we just don't like being told what to do." and the robot aliens were like, "Fine," and then they just leave, and that's the end. and I think there's something admirable about that. There's something, you can look at the Afghan Pashtun life, their pastoral, backwards, maybe Iron Age plus AKs way of life, and say, oh, they're so backwards, they're so awful. But why do they prefer it? And why do our SF guys who go over there, as was the case of the book American Spartan, I forget the Green Beret's name, why do our SF guys keep going over there and being like, there's something kind of admirable here. Something I kind of connect with and maybe even prefer over here to our civilization.
I'm not a big fan anymore of our civilization.
Well, so that brings us back to the, like, what's the objectively better outcome then? And can we say that an outcome is objectively better? A la like Ben Shapiro or something like that? Or does it come down to what our standards of good are? And
I think it does.
That itself hinges upon what myth do we aspire to? What myths do we believe in and hold to?
Yeah, and I think it does.
Yeah, and there's a connection between objectivity and truth that ties the concept into the hairiness of distinguishing different ways of life as more or less admirable. And by the way, I'm not saying I want to go live as a Pashtun in Afghanistan. I'm just saying maybe they have a legitimate claim to prefer their way of life in their own place to our way of life with 9-to-5 grinds and Microsoft Teams meetings on Mondays or whatever. So
the only argument there is, if that's the case, why are so many of the people that live there leaving and trying to get to where the Europeans are?
Well, that's an interesting question. Edward Subotin says it's Major Jim Gant. Thank you for that. That's the protagonist in American Spartan. Great book. Well, the reason that so many people from the Middle East are coming into Europe and to the United States, it's in their language. The unevangelized part of the world is known in Muslim parlance as Dar al-Harb, which is the house of war. That's where conquest has yet to fulfill the encompassing of the religion yet. But that's a project. They're like colonists of sort.
Yeah.
That's why. It's not cultural preference. Some of it's because they're lied to. Some of it's because there are like Soros agents out there saying, "Oh, move to Europe and they'll give you a free phone and a girlfriend." And 20-year-olds who don't have much opportunity in Saudi Arabia because all the rich oil money people already have 6 wives and 2 Ferraris, and they're like, "Oh, may as well roll the dice in Germany or whatever." I got a free ticket because I'm useful to some agent provocateurs in their own political chess game.
Yeah.
But that's not indicative of these Muslims preferring the Western way of life to the Eastern. The fact that they keep trying to turn the West into the East might actually indicate that they prefer the East. They just want to expand it.
Mm, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
So, um, yeah, let's see if there are any other comments here. Lauren says
Keep in
we.
mind, I'm on Central Time, so it's getting late for me.
It's getting late. Yeah, we can close this up. We've been going for quite some time now. Lauren says there's so many denominations of Christianity that have different value sets, though. True. Yes, and maybe this is why Latin America doesn't strike many people as Christian, because Catholic is very very different than
Yeah.
American Protestant and
Well,
Orthodox
Protestants say that Catholicism is a cult. That's what I always heard growing up.
Catholics say the same thing about Protestants,
Yeah,
and then they both look at Mormons like, yeah,
you're crazy.
what's going on with you? Yeah. Daniel Rose says the Younger book is wonderful. Good to know. I should read that someday.
I've
Um,
read like the first half of it, which is pretty sad because it's only like 80 pages long.
that's about my duration with many of these
I
books,
think I
though.
spent one night reading it and I got as far as I could, and then like the next day I was just wasn't into it anymore.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, I guess we should work on wrapping up. I'll conclude, I guess, my side by saying I think that the people who are pushing for Christianity as a solution to cultural problems, and as some kind of cultural, social, or political force are on the wrong foot, not just spiritually but also empirically, if you look broadly. Um, but even if you step back and say, well, even if you begin with the truth of the belief, I think there are problems there. I think not just that Christianity is not true, but that we can actually say with a great deal of certainty that Christianity and indeed all monotheisms are false. Not just Christianity, the Neoplatonist kind, the Islamic kind. Islam is false. It's not just like an enemy. It's also an enemy, whereas Christianity is a friend. It's a cousin we disagree with, or I disagree with, and I'm sure they think the same way about me and my weird Homeric shenanigans. But the as far as Christianity and politics is concerned, there's a serious danger there, and the people who look to Christian nationalism as some kind of way to restore American identity are leaning into what ultimately, on the other side of their utilitarian approach to religion, what they will find is more progressivism, more of the same that we've been seeing. They will find more John Hick, because at the end of the day, I mean, they might be a little bit more. Most of these Christian nationalists, I think, will be a little bit more defensive of the Bible than you. Um, but even
Yeah.
within the Bible, um, I don't think John Hick is spiritually off base, even though I think he has a lot more to answer for if you grant the seriousness of the content of these experiences. So I'll let you have a few final words, and then we can let you go off to to rest. It must be like 11:15 over there.
Yeah, something like that. Um, I think we're at a unique moment in my life to where pushing Christian values happens to overlap with what is popular. It's
Hmm.
trendy right now to we have these action reaction, pendulum swinging sort of things that go on. Um, and I think we're at a unique moment for right now where people are looking around and they're seeing the disaster of postmodernism and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the rainbow flags and all the rest of that stuff. And it just so happens that right now it's countercultural. It's like being a hippie almost. Like being a Christian is popular right now because people are fed up with what we've been fed for the last 10 years, and Christianity happens to be against all those things.
Yes, they can rebel against
and it
the
feels
internet.
very, popular, whereas in 10 years, that won't be the case anymore. I think what we're going to see is we're going to see an uptick in people proclaiming Christianity. I think we're going to have a revival of at least at an intellectual level of people talking about the Bible or thinking about becoming Christian.
Historically, we're overdue for a revival. We
Yeah,
get those in America about every 80 years or so.
yeah. I don't think it'll happen again, just because I think the internet and social media changed things. I don't think we can trust the patterns of
That's
history
fair.
that we've always trusted in, because I think it's almost like, growing up, everybody my age, we all remember certain episodes of Saved by the Bell, whereas now, like, my kids don't have that with another kid in California that's their age, that I know for sure that they know who Zach Morris and Kelly Kapowski are,
Right.
you know, um, Netflix and Amazon Prime and YouTube and algorithms and customization and all that has fundamentally changed how we view everything. And now my kids have to look to find somebody. It's like, oh, you watch the same YouTuber that I do, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
We're
I think we happen
diversifying.
to. I think that changed everything as far as patterns that we can, like, predictable patterns, or we can anticipate what's going to happen. I don't think we can. I think the internet and having a supercomputer in our pockets has fundamentally changed everything.
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I don't know. I have a hard time looking back historically and seeing how many places in the past everything changed. Look at the Gutenberg printing press. It's very possible the Protestant Reformation would not have happened if the printing press hadn't become a thing
Yeah,
and made the Bible available to people in their own
yeah,
vernacular. The writing itself, back around 5th century or so BC. A little bit before that, it was more of a gradual phased in thing. The stirrup. There's economists who talk about how the stirrup made the Middle Ages and the feudal system possible, and all this other stuff. And yet, how many truths about us psychologically and socially and politically remain constant through all these everything changed moments? I think you're probably correct that some of these patterns that we took for granted from like one industrial revolution to the next, yeah, those might change. We
yeah.
might not get 80-year cycles. We might break the Strauss-Howe cycle, which never applied outside of America, anyways. We might break all these things. Maybe the Strauss-Howe was never true in the first place. But there are still essential truths about us, which go back to the days of Christ and also before Jesus as well,
Hmm.
and have carried on. And these general truths about us um, are set. The things that we care about are not actually outside of the world, but are situated in the world because that's where we are. And what we care about, I think, fundamentally, are not abstract ideals, but other people. And those other people are here in this world, not in some Platonic elevated world of pure forms,
Yeah.
or in a heaven hereafter. I think what we care about are other people in this world, and um, and it's good. It's good to care about
Hmm.
them. It's not good to hate your family and to abandon them to follow a spiritual leader necessarily.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think those are the verses that everybody struggles with, man. I mean, even Christians, like, there's a reason all this is difficult to talk about, because it's not straightforward. It's not simple.
well, it can certainly induce a kind of I'll borrow the phrase of a utilitarian, moral squeamishness in
Yeah.
people who say because something is hard, The fact that something is hard and violates the instincts of the world, which is to say their own moral instincts, that should be no barrier to doing it if you have faith. And the Christian should be, first of all, be devoted absolutely and completely and wholly to God. When Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? Is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your strength. And the second is like it. He very needlessly gives a second, to love your neighbor as yourself. And there's actually a paradox there. How can you love your neighbor if you love God with all your heart? If you assume that love has something to do with attention, how can you have more than your whole heart there? And
Well, in that context, you love other people because God loves other people.
Or you love other people because they bear the image of God and they're made in the likeness of God, and because God is hidden.
I don't think it's a conflict.
Well,
I don't see it as a conflict to love God.
When I called it a paradox, I didn't mean to say it was a conflict. I meant to imply it was a puzzle, and unwrapping the puzzle, completely clarifies the spirit of Christianity and the essence of Christian spirituality, and from that essence, everything that we see in progressivism actually follows.
Gotcha.
The flattening of relationships, the abandoning your family and your nation, because while they are also image bearers of God, they are not different fundamentally in that quality from a stranger. They're no different in their the possession of this divine spark than a Samaritan you might happen to find, for example. I'm slightly abusing that parable.
No, I get it.
But it's that flattening that I think many people on the right are rebelling against when they say, no, actually my family is special to me. Not to anybody else, but it's special to me. And I have a special duty to them that is above and beyond my duty to a stranger. I have a special duty to my nation that is above and beyond my duty to other nations. And frankly, I don't want to be sending tax money to Ukraine, for example. And whereas that's, if we were to think at a universal level, well, Ukraine clearly has greater need than I do, right? maybe I'll give my last 2 pennies to those who need it most, or to give them to anybody because it's the act of giving that is somehow sanctifying. I don't think that's true. I think it's the connections that matter, and there is a specialness to certain connections. And I don't think the essence of Christianity allows for that. And it really challenges people who want it to permit it, to say, why are you fighting so hard to make this spirituality conform to what you want it to mean, which is the great struggle. So I leave it to the audience here to contemplate that, I guess, because I don't think this will be the last time we people discuss these kinds of questions. But I've kept you long enough. Are there any final things you want to say?
No, other than this is about what I expected. I expected you to talk and say a whole bunch of stuff that I can barely understand.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I haven't read nearly the same type of stuff as you have.
I will have to try to be clearer in the future. Then my apologies.
No, not at all. I didn't mean that. No, it's you have more horsepower than I do.
Well, thanks so much for coming along for the ride. Then.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for
hopefully
having me on.
Inspiring to other people. You have a copy of Holy Nihilism, don't you?
I've got all your books.
Oh man, you might enjoy it. You might not enjoy it actually. but yeah, hopefully it's inspiring to everyone who stuck around. Thanks so much for listening.